Good evening, everybody, on this very warm evening, if you're in the UK, to listen to the nation's favourite economist, Paul Johnson of the Institute for Fiscal Studies. And we're going to have a real feast tonight. And the aim is that we're going to finish up by 7 o'clock. We always finish on time. Somehow, if not happier, then at least wiser about what we're going to be facing and how robust the economy is. Paul Johnson needs absolutely no introduction. I'm not going to give him one because you all know who he is, or if you didn't know it all, you've read it on that digest. Let me just say before we go over to Paul that we love questions, and we love in particular on this University of Buckingham Great Minds series, of which this is the 18th talk. We love short and snappy questions with your name ideally on it. I try and preference students, sixth formers, if you are a student, do indicate in the question. And what a timely talk on the day that we hear that Europe is perhaps heading for a second wave, to have this talk. And over to Paul. I'm going to ask you, Paul, before you talk to us, just to talk about the room that you're in, because one of the differences between this and you speaking at a literary festival or an economics conference is that we can see the thinker, the writer in his lair, and we can also see you close up. So tell us about this room, and what is this room saying about you?
Well, I'm in the in my study at home in North London. I think if we hadn't been in lockdown at this time of the evening, I'd probably still be in my office at the IFS in Central London. What does this room say about me? Well, I don't know how much of it you can see, but you probably see that it's not as well organised as it might be. Books, papers and everything else are piled on top of each other behind me, as is many years worth of rubbish, which obviously gets piled in the study once the garage and the shed are full. So I think you can take it that I am not the world's most well-organised individual, is probably what you can take from this office.
Or you could say that it's, on the contrary, very well organised, but with a pattern that no one has yet decoded. But that's, we're going to leave all that on one side. Paul, tell us about the strengths of the economy and what we're going to be up against.
Well, let me have a go at doing that. Hopefully you can see a first slide. So I'm going to say a few words about the economy as we came into the crisis. Actually, I spent far too little time doing that in recent months. So focused have we been on COVID-19. I will then talk about what's happening at the moment, a little bit of speculation about the future, but then I'll come on to some of the non-economic, but I think really important issues that is being brought up by COVID-19. So let me start with this rather important chart, which I think tells you an awful lot, actually, about not just economics, but politics over the last decade and more. What's this showing you? It's showing you what's happened to average incomes, average household incomes, over the period from 2002 to 2019. Look first of all at the bright yellowish line. That's what's happened to the average incomes of people aged less than 60. And what you can see there is that they have barely risen in 15 years. This is the worst period for income growth, certainly in a century, possibly in a lot longer than that. In general, incomes have risen, certainly since the last war, by 2% a year or so. You might have expected them, therefore, to have risen by £100, say, over this period, and they've risen by, what's that, 20. You can think of that in other ways. If you think of the size of the economy now, relative to where we might reasonably have expected it to be back in 2008 before the last crisis, the economy is about £400 billion smaller than it would have been had it grown since 2008 at the rate it had grown at for the previous 50 years. So we came into this crisis in a situation in which incomes, productivity, growth in the economy had been at genuinely historically unprecedentedly poor levels. Another statistic to bombard you with: median hourly earnings today are no higher than they were in 2007. Well, the Bank of England has looked back in history and they think there might have been a decade around the Napoleonic Wars which was that bad. But essentially, that's been the worst decade for earnings growth in history. Second thing that this chart shows, which is rather important, I think, in understanding what's been happening, is that dark green line, and that's what's been happening to pensioner incomes over this period, so or at least incomes of people over age 60. And as you can see, those have grown a great deal faster. And there are remarkable things. Something remarkable happened in 2011, and that is that their incomes overtook, for the first time in history, incomes of people of working age. And we're talking about incomes here. This is actually incomes after you take account of housing costs. But we're talking about incomes here. We're not talking about wealth. And of course, the wealth of the older generation is always greater than the wealth of the younger generation. So a really important backdrop to everything political and economic. Very poor income growth over the last 15 years, very poor economic growth, and a situation in which those of working age have done a lot less well on average than those of pension age. So that's the first of two backdrop charts. The second one is this. Now, those of you, maybe not many of you, if you're students who are old enough, will remember the last time we had an economic crisis, which was only a decade ago, between 2008 and 2010. That led to what we have known since then as austerity, reduction in public spending with the purpose of getting public borrowing down. So you can see that picture here. So the top line here is government spending as a fraction of national income. And you can see as the crisis in 2008, 2009 unfolded, spending as a fraction of national income shot up by about 7% of national income. It shot up for two reasons. First, the government responded by increasing spending, but more importantly, the economy got smaller, and so the spending that was planned became a higher fraction of the total. The bottom line is revenues, mostly tax revenues over this period. And you can see the gap between them is borrowing. You can see back in 2009, 2010, borrowing was at about 10% of national income, 150 billion pounds back then, much the biggest level it had been since the last war. The period since then, the period of austerity, you can see with spending falling fairly swiftly as a fraction of national income, and actually those revenues, that tax line, very, very gradually rising, such that borrowing on the eve of this crisis was actually down below where it was pre-2008. So that decade of austerity had achieved one thing: it had got borrowing back down to historically normal levels. Of course, the debt, the accumulated amount of borrowing, was much higher, or is much higher today than it was back in 2008. Interest rates, of course, are so low that interest payments are lower than they were back then. The other thing you might note from this is that we've had a decade of austerity. We really have. Many areas of public spending have been cut significantly in real terms, again, pretty much for the first time in history. And yet that total spending line today, or rather a year ago, was at the same level as it was in 2007 after a decade of Labour government. So what austerity has achieved actually is just to return the state to its same size relative to the economy as it was after a decade of Labour government. Now, back at the 2019 election, the Conservative Party who won that election were committed to an end to austerity. They had a spending review which was raising public spending going forward, particularly raising spending on investment, increasing borrowing somewhat from that level, and indeed increasing it to a point where it was only just consistent with the national debt remaining stable over time as opposed to rising. So those are the two pre-crisis charts I want to show you. First, we had a very poor decade of income growth, and second, after a decade of austerity, borrowing was back down to pre-financial crisis levels, but after that austerity, the state was still as big as it was in 2007. So that's what I'll say by way of backdrop to the strength of the economy. I'm very happy to come on to more of that in questions, but let me come on now to the present day, because all of this feels like ancient history, doesn't it? Everything pre-COVID feels like ancient history. Well, this isn't ancient history because this is a set of forecasts made by the IMF yesterday. Certainly for those of us who are British, based in the UK, it's very easy to think of just what's happening to the UK economy at the moment. But it's worth reminding ourselves that this crisis is having an impact worldwide. So these are for a selected group of countries, the IMF's predictions as to what might happen to growth over 2020. And you can see that for all of these countries, the IMF is expecting a contraction in the economy of between 8 and 13%, 8% in the US, 13% in Italy and Spain, with the UK sort of in the middle at a contraction of 10%. Now, you know, why they put decimal points by these numbers is beyond me, given that, you know, these are wild guesses, but they are wild guesses which will give you the right flavour. The right flavour being that this is going to be the worst year for economic growth around the world, certainly since similar measures have been taken. The Bank of England reckons that there might have been a year in the early 1700s that was as bad as this year for growth. But I think in the UK, I think we can take it that the UK economy will contract more this year than it has ever done in history, and of course for very unusual and surprising reasons, which is largely that we've shut it down in order to control the pandemic. That's not surprising given what we've done. We've shut the economy down. It will contract. Here's another way of showing this in the UK. This is a chart from the Office of Budget Responsibility, and again you can see that the contraction expected this year far bigger than anything in the last 100 years, including at the end of the First World War and the period of the Spanish flu pandemic. At the end of this, you can see something really very important, though. So the OBR, the Office of Budget Responsibility, in what they call their baseline scenario, projects that the economy will bounce back really very quickly. Now, if that happens, then, you know, we've been through a bad year, but it doesn't matter actually too much if the economy, employment, earnings, incomes bounce back to where they otherwise would have been. Well, the government will be saddled with more debt, but otherwise we can pretty much get on with life. I don't know anyone actually outside of the Bank of England and the OBR who thinks that that is a terribly realistic projection. The real economic question to come out of this crisis is not what's happening now. We know that what's happening now is bad. It might be 10% or 15% or 20% bad, but it's bad. What we don't know is how quickly we'll bounce back. And that's what really, really matters. If the economy in 2 years' time is the same size as it otherwise would have been, well, you know, we will have got away with it in a really big way. If it's not, then we have big problems, and that's what I want to come on to say a little more about. So obviously, with the economy being much smaller, we're borrowing a lot more because tax revenues aren't coming in. But in addition, the government has been staggeringly activist in supporting the economy. So it's spending more than £120 billion. And just to be clear, that is a very big number indeed on supporting the economy over this period. I've broken that down on this chart. The biggest number there is 60 billion. That's the coronavirus job retention scheme, the furlough scheme, which pays 80% of the wages up to £2,500 a month, and is broadly speaking paying for about a third of private sector workers at the moment. That spending is going out the door at about the same rate as spending on the NHS, which is by far the biggest thing that government does. You can see that there are big increases in spending on public services, on welfare benefits, on support for business, and so on. £120 billion is more than the entire annual welfare budget, being spent in a period of 6 months to support the economy at the moment, a staggering level of spending. As a result, the OBR expects borrowing to reach £300 billion this year. I told you earlier that the borrowing levels in 2010 had reached post-war record. That record has been well and truly, or is about to be well and truly smashed by the level of borrowing we're having this year. This is just one way of representing this. This is the amount of debt that the government is selling. And you can see that over this 4 months, it's selling more than £200 billion. It's selling debt at twice the rate it was selling debt at the height of the financial crisis. The remarkable thing is that it's managing to sell that debt essentially for free. People don't want any, don't appear to want any return on government debt. That's a measure how worried they are about putting their money anywhere else. What we've learnt across developed economies actually in the last few years is that very low levels of debt interest on government debt is not a measure of how strong governments are perceived to be. It's a measure of how worried investors are about putting their money in other assets. It's also worth saying, of course, that the Bank of England has embarked on a £300 billion quantitative easing programme, which is essentially sucking up most of the debt that the government is selling. So a huge record in terms of debt. Now this will matter to the extent that borrowing continues to be high over the next few years, and that will depend on what happens to the economy. So 300 billion of borrowing is a very large amount, and if it's maintained, it will be a worrying amount. Nevertheless, the next set of policy announcements will all be about spending more, not spending less. And that's because as we gradually come out of the furlough scheme in particular, from the beginning of August, the government will insist on employers paying something towards the pay of those employees who are not working. We can expect unemployment to start rising really very substantially. So I would expect in early July we'll get some more announcements from the Treasury on more money for training, on welfare to work schemes, apprenticeship schemes, job subsidy schemes, and possibly money for infrastructure programs to employ people. Targeted tax cuts, maybe in July, maybe in a budget in the autumn. But again, despite the fact that you might think we are, when we're borrowing more than we've ever borrowed before, it's time to pare back. To the contrary, in the short run, it's all going to be about supporting the economy. And just one chart to show why that's going to be needed is even now, even whilst the furlough scheme is running, even whilst a third of private sector workers are having their wages paid by the government, you can see right at the end of this chart this astonishing increase in the numbers claiming unemployment benefits or benefits for those who are on short hours. Now, to be fair, this chart isn't completely comparable over time, but what you can see is what's happened over the last couple of months is wholly historically unprecedented in the scale of unemployment that is beginning to become apparent. And as I say, that is whilst the current furlough scheme is running. And this just shows you what I said before, that about a third of the workforce was furloughed by the end of May. The yellow bits, the yellow chunks here are those who are furloughed, and you can see that for some sectors down towards the bottom, accommodation and food service, as you expect, arts and entertainment, something like 80% of the workforce in those sectors is furloughed. Those furloughed workers share two common characteristics. One is they're much more likely to be young than the rest of the workforce. They're about 2.5, people under the age of 25 are about 2.5 times as likely to work in those furloughing sectors. More important still, their average earnings are very, very much lower than average earnings across the rest of the economy. Furloughing is something that is impacting low earners and the young much more than high earners and older workers. That's reflected, I mean, that obviously means that those most likely to lose their jobs once the furlough scheme comes to an end will be low earners and those who are young. This reflects the sectors they work in. It's also very graded in terms of who can work at home. The red bars here are people working at home, and you can see that it's in the higher skill professions, and if you certainly look at individuals, the more highly educated you are and the more you earn, the more likely you are to have been able to work at home over the last 3 months, as, for example, I and all of my colleagues at the IFS have, with more or less success, been doing. Lower earners and those in lower earning professions are much less likely to be able to work at home. So coming back to this issue of the economy and the borrowing. If the economy does bounce back to normal quickly, then we shouldn't have a big long-term problem in terms of government tax and spending. We will put up with more debt for longer, but we can afford to do that. As I said at the beginning, I don't really know anyone who thinks that that is the most likely outcome. There is almost certainly going to be a medium to long-term loss in the size of the economy of an unknown scale. If we have second and third waves of the virus, if social distancing has to be maintained or reintroduced, then that could be really quite a substantial reduction in the size of the economy 2, 3, 4 years hence. Even if we don't have that, we know that lots of businesses have gone out of business. We know lots of people are losing their jobs. It takes a long time for an economy to recover from that. That will result in the deficit being really quite substantial over the next few years. And in addition, it is very clear to me that there's likely to be a demand for extra spending over the next few years. The idea that the 9 billion increase in welfare spending, generosity of welfare benefits recently announced, will immediately be clawed back next year, I think is for the birds. It's very clear that the case for more spending on social care is extraordinarily strong. The NHS is not going to manage with the level of funding that it was expecting, given everything else that's happening and the huge backlog of cases it's going to be working with. As I've talked about, further education, training, job subsidy schemes and so on. All of this leads me to believe that we will be looking at substantial tax rises in the medium run. Exactly when is likely, of course, to be determined as much by the politics as the economics. If you look back over the last 3 decades, pretty much all tax rises occur in the first year of a parliament. Almost none occur in the last or penultimate years of parliaments. So whatever the pressure on the Chancellor, we may well find that these changes are pushed in to the next parliament if he's able to do that. Let me finish by talking just very briefly, because we've been doing a lot of work on these sorts of things at the IFS, at some other likely effects of the crisis. Well, the first I've already referred to. The NHS has actually coped in many ways very well with coronavirus, but it's coped with that at the cost of cancelling many hundreds of thousands of operations, and indeed at the cost of many people not turning up for scans and to A&E and so on. We are likely to have a substantial impact on the health of the nation and the pressures on the NHS over the next few years. We already know that there's been a major effect on mental health. We also know that recessions cause bad health. If you look at some very careful work done by colleagues of mine at the impact of the last recession and the associated increase in unemployment, we can say with some confidence that there was something like 1 million additional episodes of chronic bad health as a result of the recession, because we know that poverty and unemployment are strongly associated, particularly with poor mental health, but also that can lead to chronic physical health conditions. I'm just going to show you a chart to show you what's happened already to mental health. Just one of many that we've looked at. And let me just tell you about the data. This is data being collected on a consistent basis for the same group of people over the last decade. And so what this shows you is you can see the the numbers there refer to age groups. The red refers to women, the blue to men in a very traditional sense. And this is telling you what fraction of men and women in those age groups are reporting at least one serious mental health problem. So the column on the left, wave 9, is what those people were reporting in 2017 and 2018 when they were last contacted. So the top there is saying that 20% of women aged between 16 and 24 were reporting at least one serious mental health issue. How might that have changed? Well, using all the data we have, we can predict what that ought to have looked like, as it were, in normal times this April, and that's the second column. And you see it doesn't look terribly different, actually, to the first column. And then we can look at what actually people reported this April or this May. And that's the last column. And you can see this huge increase in the fractions of people reporting significant mental health problems, particularly, as you can see at the top, among the young, and particularly among young women. This is a crisis that has hit the young in terms of their jobs and their incomes and their education, but also in terms of their mental health more than it has the old. Obviously, as policy has been largely to protect the old. And just to reinforce that point about long-term consequences, two final things. First, those entering the labour market during recessions, which we are in the deepest of in history at the moment, tend to suffer long-term consequences. Clearly, it's going to be much harder for young people leaving school or university to get jobs and get good jobs than in normal times. There's been an absolute collapse, and again an unprecedented one, in vacancies over this period. And we know from previous recessions that doesn't just mean a period of lower earnings and unemployment, it means often many years of lower earnings and unemployment. And then finally, and possibly most worrying of all of this, and again based on a survey that we've carried out, we know that time out of school is hurting children, particularly from less well-off families. They've lost many weeks of schooling now. Those from independent schools are getting far more support from their schools and in terms of online and active teaching than those from state schools. Those within state schools, the more advantaged the state schools, the more likely the children are getting good support from them. And within families, the more advantaged families, children are spending much more time on their schoolwork and other forms of education. This could well put back many years of very slow progress towards improved educational equality for those who are affected. I could go on and on because we've done huge amounts of work in all of these areas. There is much to say about where the economy was pre-COVID. I haven't even mentioned the word Brexit, which I'm happy to discuss further if anyone has any questions. And there are many other ways in which incomes, earnings, wealth, and so on are being affected by current circumstances. But let me finish there and move to questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul, very much indeed for that sobering piece of analysis. And can we have questions coming through? There were 837 people looking at you early on, but I'm sure that's gone way over 1,000 now. Welcome if it's your first talk in this series of talks. Do pass on the information to your friends. There is the list of the 50 speakers. All speakers, like Paul, are giving up their time gratis. This is a totally free event designed to help educate people at the University of Buckingham, in this community, in this region, and way beyond. Paul, let's begin with a question here about Robert Skidelsky's subject. He's speaking next week on Keynes, and Keynes' thinking helped the world, arguably in the interwar period, come out of the recession? Might there be a great economist at the University of Buckingham or somewhere else who is going to point the way?
Well, I hope so.
Or in the IFS?
Look, I mean, in a very important way, I think the current response has been informed, possibly by Keynes, but certainly by a lot of pragmatism in terms of how to deal with the issues so far, supporting people to stay linked to their employers. The furlough scheme, as I said, the most important thing this government has done. The idea behind it being not only to ensure that people don't fall into poverty by losing their job, but also to ensure that they stay attached to employers rather than because if they're attached to their employers, they keep their job, and then you don't go through this process of losing, having high levels of unemployment and having to go through a long period of dealing with that. And that's one thing that we've learnt over many years, is that unemployment, even if it's caused by temporary problems with the economy, can have long-term, what we often think of as scarring effects. So dealing with that has been an important pragmatic part of the economic response. As I said, the next stage is going to be focused a lot on what do you do when unemployment does rise quickly. And the problem there is not so much that we don't have lots of experience of responding to that, but actually the detailed design of policies here really matters. So we know that there are job subsidy schemes and job training schemes which can be very effective, and there have historically been ones that have been very ineffective. So this is not about grand theory. This is about the practice of ensuring that the training courses that are put on are high quality and effective, and providing training in areas where that is needed, that the design of job subsidy programs is such that employers engage and keep people on in the longer run, that training is often associated with employers and so on. So that's not big theory, but that's actually where most practical, useful economics is nowadays. It is about understanding the micro details of policy, the micro details of who's got what income, what firms are behaving in particular ways, and evaluating the effectiveness of policies. So there's a lot of data and a lot of evaluation and a lot of experience out there on which I hope government will draw. I think the big theory, the big thing that Keynes changed was the view that government could and should be effective in supporting demand at times like this, and that the market was not something that always worked and provided the right outcome. I think we know that. I don't think we're going to learn much more in terms of those kinds of big theories. I think the most useful thing that economists can do now is really, as I say, what most economists spend most of their time doing, focusing on actually the practical and micro level details.
So next question, how bad do things have to get, Paul, before social unrest starts spreading out onto the streets? We know in the interwar years and other countries in the post-war period, when the economic outlook looks very bleak or is very bleak, social unrest, revolution starts. Any predictions or thoughts?
No, certainly no predictions. It's a very interesting question. We're already, it probably doesn't feel like it. We're already in the middle of the deepest recession in history. The GDP it's fallen by 25%. Staggering. I never thought I would ever say those words over the last 2 months. But at the moment, people's jobs to a large extent and their incomes to a large extent for a lot of people are being supported by the government. This starts to become much more worrisome if unemployment really starts to rise very quickly over the next few months or year. That's why, as I say, I think the next phase of government support and policy will be doing everything they can to help deal with that. Now, at what point does that result in social unrest? I don't know, though. It is worth saying that the fact that this is focused on young people might lead you to worry, because young people tend to be the ones who go in for social unrest, as it were. But let me sort of add a rider to that. You don't have to have mass unemployment to have big social and political consequences. You don't have to have people going onto the streets. It's certainly my belief that some of the populist movements around the world, I mean, there are all sorts of reasons behind the left and right populist movements. It is, in my view, not a random chance that they have grown up to be particularly strong in the wake of the last crisis, because the UK is not unique in having had austerity. It is not unique in having had very, very poor income growth. Indeed, much of that has been, certainly in the income growth, has been much worse in the US, for example. And we're not unique in having this remarkable situation where there is not just a risk, but a likelihood that the current generation of younger people, on average, may end up no better off over their lifetime than their parents. And when parents and when populations see progress stalling, I think that has political consequences. Maybe not coming out on the streets and social unrest, but I think it has political consequences.
So just to say there that Paul is speaking at the Festival of Higher Education that the university has organised on the 7th and 8th of July. There are 15 challenges to higher education, and Paul is talking about the economic challenge, which will include the challenge to students and their jobs and prospects and livelihoods and mental health. Two different questions now, Paul, on Brexit. Somebody looking saying, thank goodness that we've got Brexit at last coming up, and that's going to get the country back on its feet. And another asking, do you think now that this might help lead to sanity and postponing perhaps indefinitely Brexit as the biggest self-inflicted wound the country has ever inflicted on itself? So rather different views there.
It's very hard to predict how the government will respond in terms of whether either de jure or de facto the move out of the current phase will be delayed. I think one thing that it's worth saying, which relates to what I was saying, what's going on in the rest of the world, is that this crisis tells us again how interconnected the world is, how important trade and trade relationships are. Perhaps a quarter of the loss of output of welfare in any one country over this period, you can put down to the fact that other countries have been shrinking. So our exports have shrunk because other countries have shut down. Their exports have shrunk because we've shut down, and that's had that's an indication of the importance of these kinds of changes. Will Brexit be good or bad for the economy? I would say that there is almost complete agreement among economists that Brexit can only be bad for the economy. It's hard to see how anything else could be the case when you make trade with your biggest, richest and nearest trading partner by far significantly more difficult. How big that effect will be is much harder to predict. It will for sure be a lot smaller than the impact of coronavirus. So we may want to start to rethink our way of measuring size in terms of economic effects. The further we move away from that trading relationship, the bigger the economic effect is likely to be. The two difference, where might we end up? Well, we might end up with some kind of trade agreement which will probably focus on the manufacturing sector, unlikely to be very at all deep when it comes to services. In that world, the impact on services is actually much harder to project than the impact on manufacturing, but those successful service industries that are dependent on access to European markets will to a large extent be dependent on the kindness of those countries in allowing that to continue. Most trade deals have very little to say about services. If we don't get any kind of deal at all, then we potentially create quite a lot of additional cost on the manufacturing side of the economy, and particularly given the number of times that manufactured goods move over borders in our very integrated European economy, that could be very costly to some of the firms involved in manufacturing.
Okay, well, let's get back to something controversial for a change here. But it's very good that we had the British motorbike revving up when you talked about British manufacturing there, Paul. We've got a question from David that says, given the current crisis, is it time to bring manufacturing back to the UK, and what can the government do to support that? And should it?
Well, I suppose the first question is why do we have less manufacturing than we've had in the past? Well, this is partly a trend for most developed economies that as they become more developed, they specialize more in high value added manufacture, often with smaller workforces, and in the services sector. The UK is somewhat at the extreme of that. And actually, we're very good at producing services. We have a very big trade surplus in services and a very big trade deficit in manufactures. There's nothing intrinsically special about manufacturing in an advanced economy, and we ought to, on average, have gains from trade by specialising in those things at which for whatever reason, we do better. Now, all of that said, there have clearly been huge social costs of the move away from manufacturing in the UK, especially actually in the US. Manufacturing plants tend to be big, locally based, and local economies tend to be very dependent on those industries. And when they close down, as they have in large parts of the north and the Midlands of England and in Scotland and Wales, the scarring effect on the local economy and local people can last literally decades. So whilst on average we're better off as a result of the change in the economy, certainly it has an effect both regionally and on certain types of workers, which is very negative indeed. What can the government do to change that? In the short run, not an enormous amount, I think, is the honest answer. Governments, in my view, within a year or two, can do very little to change the shape of the economy. In the long run, they can do rather more by thinking very hard about things like technical education, sorts of competition policy, infrastructure policy, and in some cases support for individual industries, but that often doesn't work so well.
Scott asked, and thank you very much indeed, Paul, for speaking to us. Could you please say, is this a good time to start your new business? And Peter asked on top of that, what can government do to support SMEs better at this time?
Is it a good time to start a new business? Oh, goodness me. Well, why not? I mean, it's there will be there will be new opportunities, won't there? Because this is a period in which the economy is probably changing. We don't know what shape the economy will have in 2 or 3 years' time, but there is a good chance that this process or this period that we're going through will speed up processes of change, probably taking more things online, probably being bad for many businesses on the high street, for example, but good for other parts of the economy. So if you choose the right sector, and I can't tell you what the right sector is, then perhaps this is a good time to start a new business. I think this question about what government can do for SMEs is actually very important, because I think one of the risks of this period is that those firms that survive will be the big ones, the ones that have got deep pockets. And it might actually be rather good for big firms in the long run, because a lot of the SMEs might go bust. SMEs tend to have less deep pockets, be less well capitalized, and are more likely, as a result of what's happening at the moment, to be the ones that go under. So I think actually one of the top priorities of government over the next couple of years ought to be to support the SME sector, because the risk is that if they don't, then we'll be left with an even more denuded SME sector, and as a result of that, less competition and less choice for consumers. So support through, for example, the tax system may well be appropriate at this point, more than it usually would be.
And Susanna asked a practical question: is this, Paul, a good time to buy a house in England or in Spain? Apparently,
goodness knows. It's not sensible ever to predict what's going to happen to the housing market. I mean, let me say two things about that. One is that it is at least possible, isn't it, that this will result in a rebalancing of house prices between London and other parts of the country if we have social distancing for a long period and people have got used to being able to work at home. Do we need to have all these millions of people flooding into London, to central London every day, to their offices? Will this change the geographic spread of activity and where people actually work? So if, like me, your only asset is the house you own in London, you are quite worried at this moment. The second thing I'd say about house prices is that one of the things that maintained or helped maintain house prices in the wake of the last crisis was very low interest rates and a large amount of quantitative easing by the Bank of England. Well, we've got that again. We've got interest rates at 0.1%. We've got a huge amount of quantitative easing, and that will help maintain asset prices. As we've seen, it's helped maintain prices in the stock market.
Louise is asking Paul about what can government do, other than things you've mentioned, just to help us bounce back quicker, to make that recovery more of a likelihood?
I mean, there are lots of things they can think about. I mean, there's been lots of discussion about temporary VAT cuts as a way of encouraging people to go out and spend. Not sure that's the best idea right now, given the difficulty of actually spending or getting things into shops. There are other tax changes they can think about. Getting rid of stamp duty on housing transactions, for example, might encourage housing transactions, which we know are a driver of all sorts of consumption and activity in the economy. Spending on infrastructure over the next few years, including green infrastructure, can help support the economy and support jobs, and indeed was something that was to some extent already being planned. And the last bit, which I have talked about before, is just so important to do everything possible to support those who are losing their jobs back into work as quickly as possible, to stop this becoming, to stop the scarring effect on the economy lasting longer than necessary.
You anticipated Maria's question there that was about VAT. Let's go on then to Jen's question, who talks about responsibility for the media, talking about redundancies endlessly and people struggle, having a negative and perhaps self-fulfilling aspect to it?
I don't believe that media reports on the economy are self-fulfilling. I don't think anyone sort of shuts up shop because they see the media saying things aren't going very well. They can see for themselves perfectly well how things are going for their business. I think there is something to the view that the media portrayal can be more negative than necessary. Certainly when we publish things with bad news in the headline are much more likely to be reported than things with good news in the headline. That said, there is quite a lot of bad news. There is quite a lot of bad news around. I've shown you the figures on what's happening to unemployment. We know the vast numbers of people have been furloughed and the risks that are associated with that. We know what's been happening to the size of the economy over the last couple of months. So there's nothing, there's nothing surprising or secret about any of that. In the end, the big things that will affect, how the economy does, whether it's post-Brexit or post-COVID, will be determined by decisions. First of all, really importantly, and particularly in the context of Brexit, taken in corporate boardrooms around the world, which will be taken very much on the basis of what actually are the facts about tax and trade and all sorts of things like that, and decisions made by people who are very close to the markets that they're working in. So whilst I, to a degree, agree that it's easier to get negative stories in the media, I don't buy the idea that that has a self-fulfilling impact on the economy.
And two questions here about you, Paul. Would you honestly like to be Chancellor of the Exchequer, and what would you do if you were? You probably got more influence actually in the job that you have and more freedom. And are you getting better as an economist?
Oh,
do economists get better, or are they like mathematicians? They can peak in their 20s.
The first one is a really, would I like to be Chancellor of the Exchequer? Well, it would seem silly to say no, given that that is the person who makes the big economic decisions. But I'm not sure I have the requisite decisiveness to play a role like that. I'm very much a two-handed economist. On the one hand, and on the other, and I'm rather more comfortable weighing up or offering advice on the one hand, on the other, than being the person who, in the end, takes these huge decisions about things which have such a huge impact on people's lives. I also think there's also a question about whether I'd like to be a Chancellor under our current democratic structures, or whether I could be an autocratic Chancellor. I think if I had the chance to be an autocratic Chancellor, I might say yes, because there are quite a lot of things that would be good in the long run for the economy, which you can't get away with politically, whether that's changing the tax system in particular, or changing the planning system, or changing the way that social care is constructed, or whatever.
As a green economy.
Indeed, absolutely. So as an autocratic technocrat, I'd be much more comfortable than as a democratically elected Chancellor.
Well,
am I getting better? No one would vote for me or the IFS, given the things that we've said about various bits of economic policy. Does one get better as an economist? Rather different. One learns. There's different kinds of economics, as it were, and some economics is a bit like maths in that it's very, very technical, and I've never been any good at that. And I'm, whereas 20 years ago I was fairly nifty with statistics and data and programming and so on, I can no longer do that, I'm afraid, which is a terrible indictment of the atrophying of some of my skills. But I think, as you spend a long time in a career, and my career has essentially been in the economics of public policy, shall we call it, you just learn more. You speak to more people, you read more, you have more experience, and you have a better capacity to bring that together into, I hope, useful knowledge rather than just bits of information. So my experience has been that, as one goes through life, what starts off as disconnected bits of information can eventually turn into a useful body of knowledge, and that's true of whether that's economics or any other role that one plays for a long period. So I think in that sense, one does become better over time, if one continues to put the time into the learning, the reading, the speaking, the listening, and that's true not just of economics, but I think of most things that one does in life.
And 3 quick final questions in the last couple of minutes. Paul, who, without thinking about it, who is your favourite Chancellor and why? Chancellor of the Exchequer.
Oh Lord, I can't not think about it. Who's my favourite Chancellor of the Exchequer?
Who did the best job?
Well, look, Nigel Lawson did a good job on tax reform. Not such a good job on the monetary policy. Gordon Brown did a good job on the independence of the Bank of England and to a degree on spending, but not so good on tax, and certainly not so good on terms of doing far too much interfering. I quite like Philip Hammond's sort of clear-eyed views about the need for fiscal discipline, and indeed his views on Brexit. Rishi Sunak seems to me to be doing a very good job at the moment, but he's got his testing times to come, because he's currently Father Christmas, but at some point he's going to have to turn into Scrooge.
Slightly sitting on the fence there, as you
Absolutely.
were saying about your decisiveness.
And
tonight you have launched the Philip Hammond Appreciation Society, which is marvelous. And there's no time for the third question. We'll just take Abdish's, just a very quick one, which is, what is the prospect, you touched on this earlier, of a delay on the EU happening?
I really don't know. I think you need to ask a politician rather than a mere economist a question like that. It is possible that some kind of fudge will be reached which allows a delay without calling it a delay. But my reading of the politics is that the current Prime Minister has been true to his word so far, when he said that he will basically do everything to meet particular timetables on Brexit. He has done that. He has done that every time so far, and my guess is that whether it happens or not, that is still his intention.
It's always a hard man to read. Boris Johnson I was thinking of there, but Abdish, ask that to Katya Adler next week, who is talking in the series, and we've got Max Hastings on Winston Churchill, and we have also Robert Skidelsky. So lots of interest coming up. Paul, that was, as the clock here at the University of Buckingham is chiming 7, marvelous economists, punctuality and precision there with numbers. Thank you. We've really enjoyed having you tonight. That clarity and openness and stimulus that you have. You make even slightly depressing news somehow stimulating and enjoyable to listen to. We hope that you've enjoyed it just a bit, the time you spent with us. Thank you, Paul Johnson, from this entire community. The 1,000 people and many more will listen to you subsequently. That was just perfect.
Thank you very much indeed. That was great. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.